Welcome to today's compilation. Please like and subscribe to help me grow. Let's get comfortable and ready to go to sleep with today's scary stories. The shadow in the house. It had been a long, hot summer when Miriam moved into the old house on Pinecrest Hill. The place, though grand in its time, had fallen into disrepair. The once pristine white paint on the house was now chipped, revealing the tired, weathered wood beneath. The windows were clouded with dust, and the lawn had long since been overtaken by wild, untamed grass and creeping ivy. Still, the house was hers now, her inheritance after the passing of her grandmother, a woman Miriam had never known well, but who had always seemed to hover in the background of her family's life like a shadow. The house was located at the very edge of the small, isolated town of Ashton, surrounded by dense forest on one side and a dark, rolling creek on the other. The kind of place where the air was always thick with the scent of pine and the quiet hum of cicadas in the summer, broken only by the occasional creak or groan of the old house settling. Miriam didn't mind the isolation. After years of living in the bustling city, she found solace in the quiet, and the house, though large and somewhat oppressive, felt like a retreat, a fresh start. She had recently gone through a difficult breakup, and the idea of getting away from the constant reminders of her old life seemed like just what she needed. But the house was old, and it had a history Miriam didn't know much about, but one that was slowly starting to reveal itself to her in ways she couldn't explain. The first night she stayed there, Miriam woke up to the sound of footsteps outside her door. Slow, deliberate steps that echoed in the silence of the old house. She sat up in bed, listening intently, but when she opened her door, the hallway was empty. The house was still, as if it had never moved. The second night, the sound returned. This time, Miriam thought she heard something else. Soft whispers, like voices, murmuring just below the threshold of comprehension. She held her breath, straining to hear, but when she opened the door, there was nothing. Just the dim light from the moon casting shadows along the hallway. At first, Miriam dismissed it as the house settling, the creaks and groans of a structure that had seen more than its fair share of years. But as the days passed, the sounds began to change. They became more insistent, louder. One night, she awoke to the unmistakable sound of someone crying, soft, pitiful sobs that echoed through the walls. Miriam wasn't sure what to make of it. She wasn't the type to believe in ghosts or hauntings, but there was something about the house that gnawed at her, a feeling that clung to her like a heavy fog. It wasn't just the sounds. It was the way the house seemed to watch her, the way the shadows seemed to move just a little too quickly, the way the air felt unnaturally cold in certain rooms. The old staircase, for example. Every time she descended it, she felt a cold breath on the back of her neck, as if someone, or something, was standing just behind her. She would glance over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone there, but each time, the staircase was empty. On the third day, she found something strange in the attic. She had been exploring the house, looking for anything that might need fixing before she moved in properly. She had been warned by the townsfolk about the attic. "Don't go up there," they had said, almost as if it was a secret they couldn't share. But Miriam was curious, and when she found the creaky ladder leading up into the darkness, she felt an undeniable urge to climb. The attic was dusty, filled with old furniture covered in moth-eaten sheets and crates full of forgotten belongings. It smelled of mildew and rot, and the air was thick with dust motes floating in the faint light that filtered through a small, cracked window. As she rummaged through the piles of old things, Miriam found a box hidden behind an old wardrobe. It was small, wooden, and locked. She couldn't help but feel a strange unease as she stared at it. She didn't have the key, but the lock was old and rusted, so she pried it open with a butter knife she found in the attic. Inside, there was a small stack of yellowed letters and a strange black and white photograph of a woman standing in front of the house, Miriam's house, only much younger in a different time. The woman in the photograph had a stern, almost angry expression on her face. She was dressed in dark clothes, her eyes sharp and piercing. But it wasn't the photograph that bothered Miriam the most. It was the letter she found beneath it. The letter was addressed to someone named Eli, written in elegant, slanted handwriting. Miriam unfolded it, but as she began to read, her heart froze in her chest. I have seen the shadow again. It follows me at night, standing at the foot of my bed. I know it's not a dream, for it whispers my name, calling me to the attic. I fear it is the same shadow that took my sister. And now I am next. The letter went on, speaking of strange occurrences in the house. Whispers in the walls, cold spots, the heavy feeling of being watched. It spoke of an entity that haunted the house, something dark and malevolent, something that had claimed the lives of those who had lived there before. Miriam felt the blood drain from her face as she read the last line. I hear it now at my door. I know it is time. She dropped the letter, her hands shaking. It was as if the room had grown colder, the air pressing in on her from all sides. The attic felt darker now, as if the shadows themselves were alive, stretching toward her. Suddenly, she heard it. The faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the stairway below. Miriam's heart raced. She turned, her breath caught in her throat, and peered down into the dark hallway. The footsteps were getting louder, closer, until they seemed to be right outside the attic door. She backed away from the ladder, her body stiff with fear, her mind racing for an explanation, any explanation. But as she turned to look back at the door, she saw it. Something moving in the dark, something tall and thin, standing at the top of the stairs. It had no face, just a shadow, a shifting mass of darkness, its shape ever-changing, but its presence undeniable. Miriam froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. The shadow didn't move toward her, but it seemed to be watching, waiting. Then the whisper came, a voice not from the shadow, but from the very walls themselves. It was a low, guttural sound, like something ancient, something that had been buried for too long. You should have left. Miriam's breath caught in her throat as the whisper reverberated through the walls, a sound so deep it seemed to pulse through the very air around her. You should have left. The shadow? No, it wasn't just a shadow. It was something else entirely. Remained still at the top of the staircase, its presence suffocating the room. Miriam's legs trembled beneath her, the realization that this was not a figment of her imagination settling like a heavy weight on her chest. She could feel her heart thudding in her ears, the blood rushing in her head. The attic felt unbearably cold now, the temperature dropping as if the very life had been sucked out of the space. Her mind screamed at her to run, to flee down the ladder, out of the house, but her body refused to obey. She was frozen in place, rooted to the floor, her eyes locked on the shifting black mass. For a long moment, neither she nor the thing moved. The only sound was the relentless ticking of an old clock somewhere below, each tick like a hammer driving the tension deeper into the air. Then, without warning, the shadow shifted. It moved. No, it slithered down the stairs with an unnatural fluidity, like smoke being sucked into a vacuum. Miriam could feel the weight of its gaze on her, even though it had no eyes, no face, no features at all. Her pulse was hammering in her throat, and without thinking, she spun and bolted toward the trapdoor. She yanked the ladder down with one desperate motion and began to climb down, the cold air from the attic still nipping at her heels. The whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent. You are not safe. Miriam reached the bottom of the ladder, stumbling into the hallway. She could hear the footsteps again, growing nearer, echoing from the darkened corners of the house. Her chest was tight with panic, but she forced herself to move. She had to get out, had to leave this place. She ran through the hallway, past the room where she'd first heard the crying, now silent, the walls almost seeming to close in around her. She reached the stairs, but as she started to descend, she felt it, an invisible pressure, like a hand on her shoulder, forcing her back. She froze, every muscle in her body locked with dread. A low, almost inaudible sound reached her ears, a dry, rasping breath coming from somewhere behind her. Miriam didn't turn around. She couldn't. She had learned long ago that some things were better left unseen. She ran down the stairs, her feet pounding against the creaky steps, until she reached the front door. She flung it open, desperate for air, for freedom. The cool night wind hit her face, but as she stepped onto the porch, she heard it again. Faint at first, but unmistakable. A whisper, this time from behind her. "You can't escape." Miriam turned, her breath coming in short gasps. There, standing at the threshold of the house, was a figure. It was a woman, tall and gaunt, her face obscured by a tangle of black hair that hung in matted strands over her eyes. She wore an old-fashioned dress, the fabric tattered and worn, as if it had been through years of neglect. Miriam's heart pounded in her chest, her mind reeling. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt like lead. The woman took a slow step forward, and Miriam instinctively took a step back. Suddenly, the woman's face lifted, her features coming into view. Miriam gasped. The woman's face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, were fixed on Miriam with an intensity that made her skin crawl. There was something wrong about her eyes, something ancient and unfathomable, like they had seen things no human should ever witness. Miriam opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat was dry, her voice lost somewhere in the terror that gripped her. She stumbled backward, her foot catching on the edge of the porch, and she fell hard onto the grass. The woman took another step forward, and Miriam could feel the ground beneath her trembling, as if the very earth was reacting to her presence. "You are mine," the woman whispered, her voice a soft rasp that sounded both close and impossibly far away, like it was coming from somewhere deep underground. Miriam scrambled to her feet, her pulse racing. She had to get away. She had to get to the town. But as she looked toward the dark road that led down the hill, she saw it. The trees surrounding the house, the ones that seemed to stretch endlessly into the distance, were moving. Not in the way trees move in the wind, but in a slow, deliberate shift, as if they were alive, as if they were closing in on her. Miriam's eyes darted back to the woman. She took another step forward, and this time, Miriam could feel the weight of her presence like a vice around her chest. It was suffocating, oppressive. "Please," Miriam whispered, though she knew it was useless. "I don't want this. I just want to leave." The woman's lips twisted into a cruel smile, a smile that stretched unnaturally wide, showing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. The expression sent a chill through Miriam's spine. "You cannot leave," the woman said, her voice now louder, more commanding. "The house has claimed you, just as it claimed all those before you. You are bound to it. You will never escape." Miriam turned and ran, her heart pounding as she tore across the lawn toward the woods. She didn't look back, though she could feel the weight of the woman's presence behind her, could feel the trees closing in around her. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her legs burning from the effort, but she pushed herself harder, faster. The path through the woods was narrow, overgrown with brambles and vines, but Miriam barely noticed. All she could focus on was getting away, getting as far from that house as possible. The deeper she went into the woods, the quieter it became. The air grew still, and the only sound was the pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears. She didn't stop until she reached the creek, the same creek she had seen from the house, winding through the trees like a dark ribbon in the night. Miriam staggered to the water's edge, her chest heaving with exertion. She bent over, hands on her knees, gasping for breath, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She was safe now, she told herself. She had made it out. The house was far behind her. But then, from somewhere beyond the trees, she heard it, a low, mournful cry. It was the same sound she had heard when she first arrived at the house, the sound of someone crying in the dark. The cry echoed through the woods, rising and falling in a pattern that seemed to mimic the rhythm of the wind. And as Miriam stood there, her heart thudding painfully in her chest, she realized something that made her blood run cold. The cry wasn't coming from the house anymore. It was coming from the trees, from all around her, like it was moving through the forest itself, as if the woods were alive, responding to her presence. The woods were not safe either. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Miriam whipped around, her eyes scanning the dark expanse of trees. She wasn't alone. The shadows were closing in, And this time, they weren't just in the house. And the shadow that had followed her, had it been real? Or was it part of the forest now? Before she could react, the earth beneath her feet seemed to tremble, a low rumbling rising from the ground. The trees around her began to shift, their branches groaning and bending unnaturally, as though they were stretching toward her, trying to grab hold. And that's when she saw it, a figure standing between the trees, its silhouette tall and distorted in the darkness. It was the woman from the house. The figure took one slow step toward her, and Miriam knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that she would never escape. Not the house, not the woods, not the shadows that had already begun to claim her. The woman smiled, a chilling grin that revealed too many teeth. "You're never leaving, Miriam," she whispered, her voice carrying through the trees like a dying wind, and the shadows closed in around her. "Certainly, let's continue the story and bring it to its chilling conclusion." The Shadow in the House, Part 3, the end. Miriam stumbled backward, her legs shaking as the figure, the woman, took another slow, deliberate step toward her. Her breath came in ragged gasps, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and decay. She tried to scream, but the sound was caught in her throat, her voice swallowed by the unnatural stillness of the woods. The trees around her creaked and groaned, their limbs twisting as though they had minds of their own, closing in on her, trapping her. The woman's face was a mask of cruelty, her wide, hollow eyes locked onto Miriam with an intensity that made her feel as though she were being pulled into the darkness itself. There was no escape. Miriam's mind raced for any way out. She turned and ran, the ground beneath her feet uneven, the darkness swallowing everything in her path. Her legs burned, her lungs screamed for air, but the forest seemed to stretch on forever. The trees closed in tighter, their branches reaching toward her like gnarled fingers, pulling at her clothes, tugging at her hair. She could hear the woman behind her, her footsteps impossibly close, but every time Miriam looked over her shoulder, there was nothing, just the deep, oppressive darkness of the woods. The whispering grew louder, now a chorus of voices, low and menacing, the words indistinguishable but filled with a sense of foreboding. "You can't outrun it. It's already inside you. You belong here, Miriam." Each voice seemed to echo from every direction, as if the trees themselves were speaking, the forest alive with the power of an ancient, malevolent force. Miriam's heart pounded in her chest, a drumbeat of terror that threatened to tear her apart. She ran until her legs gave out beneath her, her breath ragged and shallow. She fell to the ground, hands scraping against the rough soil as she tried to push herself up, but the ground beneath her felt wrong, like it was moving, shifting. She looked up, and in that moment the world seemed to blur. The trees, the woman, the shadows, they all converged on her, pulling her in from every side. The woods no longer felt like the forest she had known when she first arrived at the house. They were alive, a vast, ever-changing maze that twisted around her, confusing her sense of direction. The woman was no longer just a figure standing in the distance. She was right there, at the edge of her vision, her gaunt form towering over Miriam. The face that had once been pale and featureless now twisted into something horrific, sharp, jagged teeth like those of a predator, eyes that glowed with an otherworldly light, and skin that was pale, stretched tight over a skull-like frame. And then the woman spoke. "You've always known, always felt it." The words cut through Miriam like a knife. She felt them resonate deep within her chest, a truth she had refused to acknowledge until now. "This house, this place, it's yours, and it has claimed you." Miriam's stomach churned as the realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She had never truly been free of this place, not even when she had left the city. Her grandmother's house wasn't just an inheritance. It was a curse, and the forest, the woods that surrounded it, were just an extension of that curse. The house was alive, and it had been waiting for her to return. The woman smiled again, her face a grotesque mask of hunger. "You belong to the shadow now, Miriam. You've always belonged to the shadow." Miriam wanted to scream. She wanted to run, to fight, but her body refused to obey her. The darkness was closing in, pulling her under, suffocating her, wrapping around her in cold, icy tendrils. She felt herself falling, as though the ground itself had given way beneath her, and she tumbled into the black void. She was sinking down into the earth, into the roots of the ancient trees. Her body ached, her chest tight with the weight of the shadow that pressed in from all sides. And then she saw it. The darkness, stretching far beyond the trees, deeper than the night itself, a vast, endless void that seemed to devour everything. A single thought crossed her mind, a desperate thought, as the forest swallowed her whole. Why didn't I leave? But it was too late. The ground gave way entirely, and Miriam fell. Somewhere in the distance, a woman's voice echoed through the woods, as if from the very core of the earth. The house has claimed another. The wind howled through the trees, the branches creaking like old bones. The shadows, the ones that had followed Miriam since the beginning, stretched and twisted, merging into the darkness that had always been there, waiting. And somewhere, far away, in the house on Pinecrest Hill, the attic door creaked open. The whispering began again. This marks the end of Miriam's journey. The house, the woods, and the shadows have claimed her, just as they had claimed those before her. The cycle continues, as the forest and the house wait for their next victim. The whispering, the chilling voices, and the ever-present shadows remain, ever hungry, ever patient. The Haunting of the Old Miller House. The following story is based on true events. It was the summer of 2007 when I first heard about the old Miller house in our small, seemingly quiet town of Brooksville. I had just moved to the area with my family, settling into a house on the edge of town near the woods, not far from a long-forgotten hill that loomed over the landscape like a forgotten sentinel. The hill, along with the houses that dotted its slopes, was said to be the site of some of Brooksville's oldest, most haunted properties. But among them, the Miller house stood out, both in reputation and in the chilling stories that clung to it. Locals in the town often spoke of it in hushed tones, and though there was no outright warning, I could tell the house was something people didn't approach lightly. It was a large, 3-story Victorian mansion, crumbling and overgrown with ivy, a relic from a time when Brooksville had been a thriving mill town. The house had been abandoned for nearly 30 years after its last inhabitants. The Millers mysteriously disappeared one winter, leaving behind only half-finished meals, clothes left hanging in closets, and a dog who had starved to death in the yard. It was as if the family had vanished into thin air, leaving nothing but an unsettling silence in their wake. The house was located at the end of a long dirt road, hidden by overgrown trees and a thick line of brush that made it appear almost as though it didn't want to be found. I first caught a glimpse of it on an afternoon when the sun had begun to set, casting long orange shadows across the hill. The house stood like a looming figure at the top, dark windows reflecting the dying light in a way that made my stomach tighten. Something about it didn't sit right with me from the moment I laid eyes on it. It wasn't until a few weeks after we moved in that I learned about the history of the Miller house, when I bumped into Mrs. Davies, an elderly woman who had lived in Brooksville all her life. We were talking one evening in the local diner, and as we exchanged pleasantries, I asked her about the Miller house. Her reaction was immediate, and the change in her demeanor was chilling. She stiffened, her hands clutching the edge of her coffee cup so tightly I thought it might shatter. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You've heard the stories, haven't you?" she asked, her eyes darting around the diner as though making sure no one else could hear. I nodded, half embarrassed that I had dared ask. She glanced over her shoulder again and then began to speak in a low, almost conspiratorial voice. "The Millers weren't the first ones to go missing there," she said. "The house has always had a strange pull on people. It's hard to explain, but people who live there, well, they tend to disappear. It's as though the house has a mind of its own, and it doesn't want anyone to leave." Her words were laced with a kind of quiet urgency, as if she feared speaking them aloud might give the house some sort of power over her. I couldn't understand at the time why she was so fearful, but as she continued, I started to feel the weight of her words. "They were good people, the Millers," she said. "Nice folks, but when they moved in, things started happening. Strange noises in the walls, objects moving on their own, doors opening and closing in the middle of the night. Mr. Miller, he swore up and down that he saw something, a shadow, standing at the foot of their bed. And Mrs. Miller, well, she said she heard voices, voices that weren't hers or anyone else's. But she was afraid to tell anyone, you know? It's bad luck to speak of such things. At this point, Mrs. Davies lowered her voice even further, as though sharing a deeply held secret. She looked around once more, making sure no one was listening. Mrs. Miller, she started seeing things. People standing in the windows at night, people who weren't there. And when she went to get help, when the family finally left, well, the house was empty, but it wasn't a vacant. The feeling in that house, it'll never leave. It's like it's waiting, and it'll take anyone it can. Her words lingered in the air, heavy and thick, and though the diner was full of chatter, I could feel the quiet settle around us like a blanket. Mrs. Davies sat back, her hands trembling slightly, and I could see a trace of genuine fear in her eyes. She didn't seem like the type of person to exaggerate stories, especially not ones like this. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the images she had painted in my mind. The Millers' sudden disappearance, the house standing like a silent sentinel over the hill, waiting for its next victim. And yet, despite the growing unease in the pit of my stomach, I couldn't help but feel drawn to the house. It was as if something was calling me, whispering through the walls, asking me to uncover its secrets. A few days later, I decided to visit the Miller house. It was late afternoon when I finally made my way to the house. The air was thick with humidity, and the overgrown path to the front door was nearly impossible to navigate. Vines hung like tendrils from the trees surrounding the property, and the faint sound of rustling leaves felt almost unnatural, as though the land itself was alive. As I stepped up to the front porch, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The house seemed to breathe, the faintest of creaks coming from within as if it had been waiting for me. The door was ajar, its paint peeling and weathered. I pushed it open with a groan of rusted hinges. Inside, the house was eerily still. Dust motes floated in the air, caught in the pale shafts of sunlight that filtered through the broken windows. The floorboards creaked underfoot as I moved deeper into the house. It felt cold inside, despite the heat of the day, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I made my way through the house, exploring the rooms that had been abandoned for so long. The living room was filled with old furniture draped in faded, moth-eaten sheets. A grandfather clock stood in the corner, its hands frozen at 3:15. A staircase led to the second floor, but I hesitated. Something about the second floor felt wrong, as though the very air up there was thicker, more oppressive. I continued through the first floor, my curiosity pushing me forward despite the mounting dread that filled my chest. When I reached the kitchen, I saw that a rusted pot still sat on the stove, as though someone had forgotten it in the midst of cooking. The smell of something long spoiled filled my nose, and I quickly turned away. As I stepped back into the hallway, I heard it, a soft sound, almost imperceptible at first. A whisper. I stopped dead in my tracks, straining to hear. Help! The voice was faint, but unmistakable. It wasn't a man's voice or a woman's. It was something else, something in between, like a soft, desperate sigh coming from the walls themselves. I looked around, but there was no one there. It's just the wind, I told myself, or maybe the house settling. But deep down, I knew it wasn't the wind. I tried to shake off the unease, but as I moved to leave the hallway, I saw it. A shadow at the end of the corridor. It wasn't cast by anything in the room, and yet it lingered, growing darker, more defined. The air seemed to grow colder as the shadow stretched toward me, its shape almost human. In a flash of terror, I bolted for the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the whisper again, now louder, more urgent. Don't leave. Stay. I yanked open the door and stumbled outside, gasping for air. The oppressive weight of the house seemed to lift as I stepped onto the porch, but the feeling of being watched never left. I glanced back at the darkened windows of the Miller house, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing behind the glass. And then, in a blink, it was gone. That night, I didn't sleep. The whispering, the shadow, the strange pull of the house. It all haunted my thoughts. Mrs. Davies had been right. The house had a way of getting into your mind, of making you feel like you couldn't leave. It had been waiting for me, just as it had waited for the Millers before me. After my first visit to the Miller house, I couldn't shake the sense of something lingering in the back of my mind, something I couldn't explain. The chill that had crept over me in the house, the strange shadow, and the whispering voices. It all haunted my every waking moment. The house, it seemed, had a grip on me, even though I was no longer physically there. And it wasn't just me. The entire town of Brooksville seemed to be caught in its shadow. I began to notice things around town that I hadn't before. Small signs, almost imperceptible, of how deeply the Miller house affected everyone who had ever set foot on its grounds. That same evening, after returning home, I bumped into an older man at the grocery store. He looked familiar, but I couldn't place him right away. His face was weathered, as though years of hardship had left their mark. His eyes, however, were wide with a nervous energy, and when he saw me, he immediately crossed the aisle to where I was standing. "You went in, didn't you?" he asked quietly, his voice raspy, his gaze darting nervously to either side. I nodded, unsure how to respond. He gave me a long, searching look before leaning in closer, his breath smelling of tobacco and stale coffee. "You felt it, didn't you? The house. It changes you." I had heard rumors about how the house seemed to affect people differently. Some said it made them mad, some said it drove them to leave, and some, like Mrs. Davies, swore that those who spent too much time there simply vanished, like the Millers. The man didn't give me a chance to ask further questions. He turned abruptly, his face pale and grim, and hurried away, disappearing down an aisle. The exchange left me unsettled, but it also confirmed something I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. There was something undeniably wrong with the Miller house. Over the next few days, I heard more about the house from the locals, each story adding to the growing sense that the house wasn't just abandoned. It was waiting, a patient, ever-watchful predator. One evening, I ran into Mark, a man who worked as the local handyman. He was in his mid-40s, quiet, with a gruff demeanor that made him seem unapproachable, but something about him seemed different that night. He was visibly shaken, and when he saw me, he paused, his hands gripping the edge of his truck like he was trying to steady himself. "You look like you've seen a ghost," I said, trying to lighten the mood. Mark didn't smile. His face was drawn, his eyes red-rimmed. "I've seen something worse than a ghost. It's that damn house." He nodded toward the hill in the distance, where the silhouette of the Miller house stood like a dark sentinel against the twilight sky. "What do you mean?" I asked cautiously. His reaction was enough to make me realize that this wasn't just town folklore. Something had happened to him. Mark took a long drag from his cigarette, his hand shaking. "I've done work for people around here for years. You name it, plumbing, roofing, yard work. But nothing compares to the time I went up to the Miller house. A few months ago, a woman, young, blonde, hired me to fix a busted pipe up there. Said she wanted to start getting it ready to sell. I thought it was strange, but I needed the job, so I went up there. It was the dead of winter." I shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the story was about to take a darker turn. "It's colder up there than you think, you know? Always feels like the place is freezing, even in the middle of summer," Mark continued, his voice low and distant, as if he were reliving the memory. "I went in through the back, because the front door was stuck. Never could get it open. The place was like a mausoleum. No lights, no heat, just cold, dead silence. And I could feel it. Something was watching me. I know that sounds crazy, but I swear to you, I could feel eyes on me, even though I was alone." What happened next? I was in the kitchen, trying to fix the pipe when I heard it. A voice, just a whisper at first, but it wasn't the wind. It wasn't any kind of draft. It was too clear. I thought I was hearing things. The voice said, "Get out." And then the door to the pantry slammed shut, so hard the whole house seemed to shake. Mark paused, his eyes wide, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his face. I tried to keep working, but then I heard footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate steps. But I knew no one was up there. I had locked the door before I started working. I could feel it. Something was in the house, and it was getting closer. He stopped again, visibly shaken. I could see the sweat beading on his forehead. I didn't stay long. I packed up my tools and I got the hell out of there. The woman, she never showed up to pay me. I think she knew what I'd seen. And you know what? I never went back. Never will. He looked at me then, his eyes intense, as though searching for some sort of understanding. Some places are cursed, you know? The Miller house is one of them. Once it gets its claws into you, it never lets go. For the next few weeks, I couldn't get Mark's words out of my head. His story had shaken me more than I expected, but it wasn't until I spoke to Mrs. Davies again that I realized just how deep the connection between the house and its victims ran. I met her one afternoon outside the local post office. Her usually calm demeanor was gone, replaced by a look of outright distress. Her hands shook slightly as she clutched her purse, and her eyes kept flickering toward the hill where the house stood. "You shouldn't go back up there," she told me urgently, her voice laced with fear. "It's not just the house. It's everything around it. The land, the trees, the very ground is cursed. Don't you see? The Millers weren't the first family to vanish. There's a pattern, a cycle that repeats every few decades." I frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "The first disappearances happened back in the early 1800s. Families who moved into that house, one after the other, would vanish without a trace. No one ever knew what happened to them. It was as if they ceased to exist. The house, it keeps taking, and the town has been silent about it. People are afraid to speak the truth because the house, it doesn't just kill, consumes. It changes." Her voice faltered, and she looked away, as though afraid even speaking the words might provoke something unseen. After the Millers, the next family was supposed to move in, but they didn't last long. They moved out in the middle of the night. The father swore he heard children's laughter echoing in the halls, but when he went upstairs, the rooms were empty, just an oppressive silence. The last straw came when he saw a figure, tall, thin, with glowing eyes, standing in the attic window. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "Mrs. Davies, what do you mean glowing eyes?" She met my gaze, her expression full of sorrow and a hint of regret. "It's the house, child, and whatever it is, it doesn't just want to be forgotten. It doesn't want anyone to leave. And if you go back, it will claim you too." After my conversation with Mrs. Davies, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house had begun to know me. A strange sensation had settled in my chest, a feeling that I wasn't alone even when I was. The town seemed quieter now, as if the whispers of the Miller house had seeped into the very fabric of Brooksville. The urge to return to the house grew stronger, but with each passing day, I fought it harder. I had seen enough, heard enough, but deep down, I knew that the house, the stories, and the people who had been touched by it, none of it was just coincidence. It was something darker. I left Brooksville the following week. My family moved away, and though I thought I could finally put the Miller house behind me, I realized too late that some things follow you. As I sit here now, writing these words, I can still hear the whisper in my ears sometimes, soft, like a memory. "Don't leave. Stay. The house still waits." I never went back to the Miller house after that day. I didn't need to. I had learned all I needed to know. Some houses, no matter how old or forgotten, never let go. They keep calling, waiting until someone finally listens. And when they do, they're never the same again. The silent visitor. It had been a quiet, uneventful evening when Clara first noticed something was wrong. She had just moved into her new apartment, a small, one-bedroom unit on the top floor of an old building on the edge of town. The place had character. Creaky floors, faded wallpaper, and windows that offered a stunning view of the city skyline. The rent was affordable, and after the chaos of moving, she was relieved to have a place of her own. But it didn't take long for things to feel off. Started small. At first, she assumed it was just the building settling. the creaks in the walls, the soft whispers of the wind through the cracks in the windows. But then, late one night, Clara heard something that made her blood run cold. She was sitting on the couch, flipping through a book when she heard it. A slow, deliberate tapping on the apartment door. It was faint, almost like a fingernail against wood, but unmistakable. At first, she thought it was just the wind, or maybe the neighbor's kids playing around in the hallway. But when she stood up and walked toward the door, the sound stopped. Clara waited for a moment, her hand hovering over the doorknob. The hallway outside was silent. The building was old, but she had never heard any sounds like this before. No echoes, no voices, just the deep, unsettling silence of an old building at night. She opened the door, expecting to see someone, maybe a neighbor or a maintenance worker, but there was no one. The hallway stretched out in both directions, empty and dimly lit by a single flickering bulb overhead. The door to the stairwell was at the far end of the hall, and the elevator doors were shut, silent. Clara frowned, feeling a chill creeping down her spine. She closed the door, locked it, and returned to her couch. She tried to shrug it off, telling herself it was nothing, but the unease lingered. The next night, it happened again. The tapping, soft, persistent. Again, she checked the hallway, but it was empty. No sign of anyone. But this time, she noticed something else. A faint scent. It was strange, almost metallic, like iron. She sniffed the air, but the smell was gone before she could identify it. For days, the tapping continued, each night growing louder and more persistent. And still, no one was there when Clara opened the door to check. It wasn't long before Clara began to dread the evenings. She found herself staying late at work just to avoid the apartment, coming home only when she had to. She couldn't explain it, but something about the apartment, about the door, felt wrong. It was as if the space was waiting for her, watching her, biding its time. Then, one night, things took a darker turn. Clara had just finished showering and was drying off in the bathroom when she heard the tapping again. This time it was louder, more urgent. But this time something was different. There was no mistaking it now. The sound was coming from inside the apartment. Her heart skipped a beat. The tapping wasn't at the door. It was coming from the hallway, and it was moving. The sound was coming closer. Footsteps, but they weren't her own. Frozen in place, Clara listened as the footsteps drew nearer. A slow, dragging sound, as if someone was shuffling their feet along the floor. Then it stopped. She held her breath. The air in the apartment seemed to grow heavier, thicker. Her eyes flicked to the bathroom mirror, but there was nothing unusual, just her own reflection, pale and wide-eyed in the dim light. But when she turned back toward the door, she saw it. There, at the end of the hallway, was a figure. A shadow barely visible, standing just out of the reach of the light. It was tall and thin, and though Clara could not see its face, she could feel its presence. The air grew colder, and the oppressive feeling of dread pressed down on her chest. Clara backed away from the door, her hands trembling. She was about to scream, to call for help, but the words caught in her throat. The figure didn't move, simply stood there, waiting, watching. Suddenly, the tapping started again. But now it was louder, more insistent, as if it were demanding her attention. She turned toward the door, her body frozen in place, and in that moment, the figure stepped into the light. It was a woman, or at least it looked like one. She wore a faded, old-fashioned dress, but her skin was an ashen gray, stretched thin over her bones. Her hair was long and wild, hanging in tangled strands around her face, and her eyes were hollow, black voids. Clara gasped, stumbling back toward the bathroom. She wanted to run, to escape, but her legs wouldn't move. The figure took another step forward, its footsteps echoing in the silence, dragging its feet across the wooden floor. The room seemed to grow colder still, the air thick with the stench of iron, the metallic scent making Clara's stomach churn. Then the figure opened its mouth. No words came out, but Clara could hear the unmistakable sound of breathing, slow, deep, labored, as if the figure was trying to speak, but the words would not come. For what felt like an eternity, Clara stood there, paralyzed. Her gaze locked onto the figure as it slowly shuffled toward her. The tapping continued, louder now, as if the very walls were closing in around her. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. Clara blinked, her heart pounding in her chest. She rushed to the hallway, but it was empty. The silence returned, deafening and oppressive. No footsteps, no figure, no tapping. For a moment, Clara thought she might have imagined it. Perhaps it was the stress of moving into a new place, or the isolation of living alone. But as she stepped back into the living room, she noticed something. On the floor, in the middle of the room, was a small puddle of something dark. Blood. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The blood was fresh, warm, and it pooled in a circle on the floor, as if someone or something had been standing there. That was when Clara understood. The figure wasn't a figment of her imagination. It had been real, and it had left a mark on the apartment. Terrified, she gathered her things and left the apartment, never to return. She later found out that the building had once been the site of a gruesome murder many years ago. A young woman had been killed in the very unit Clara had been living in, and her body was never found. It was rumored that her spirit still lingered, trapped between the walls of the apartment. Clara moved into a new place the very next day, but she couldn't escape the feeling that something had followed her. It was as though the presence from the apartment had slipped into her life, quietly, like a shadow. Every night since, she's heard the tapping again, soft, persistent, from the corner of her room, and each time it draws closer. Clara moved into her new apartment the day after she fled from the haunted building on the outskirts of town. She tried her best to forget everything that had happened. The figure with the hollow eyes, the blood that wasn't there when she first looked, the feeling that some presence had followed her out. But no matter where she went, the tapping began again. At first, it was light, almost like a persistent knock at the door, but when she opened it, no one was there. Eventually, the tapping grew louder, more insistent, more familiar. It was coming from inside her new apartment now, always at night, just as it had before. No longer content with simply listening to the eerie sounds in silence, Clara took matters into her own hands. She wasn't going to let the terror rule her life. She'd seen the bloodstain in her old apartment. She knew the stories of the woman who had been murdered in the building. But here, this was a new place, a fresh start, or so she thought. Clara stayed up late one night, determined to catch whatever it was making the noise. She sat on the couch, staring at the old grandfather clock that ticked in the corner, its hands frozen at midnight. She refused to blink, determined to ignore the cold draft that slipped in from the edges of the window. Then the tapping began, slow at first, then rapidly increasing in speed, as if something were trying to get her attention. She stood up cautiously, heart pounding in her chest, and turned toward the hallway. But this time, the tapping wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the bedroom. The cold air thickened. The temperature in the room seemed to drop suddenly, a chill creeping up her spine as if the very walls were closing in. Clara walked toward the bedroom, her hands shaking as she reached for the doorknob. She could feel the presence now, pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. It was as if whatever had been tormenting her was finally coming to claim her, and it was ready. She swung the door open. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made. The curtains swayed slightly in the breeze. It looked just as it always did, quiet, undisturbed, almost peaceful. But Clara's instincts screamed that it was far from that. The tapping started again, louder now. It wasn't coming from the door. It wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from underneath the bed. She froze, her blood running cold. No, not again. Not here. With a trembling breath, Clara dropped to her knees and peered under the bed. Nothing. Then, in the quiet, the tapping stopped. And then she heard it. A soft, whimpering sound. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She had heard this before. It was the same noise she'd heard in the hallway when the figure had appeared. So faint, so broken, as if someone was struggling to speak. "Help me," Clara gasped, her breath catching in her throat. She whipped around, looking wildly for the source of the voice. And then she saw it. A figure stood at the foot of her bed, pale and gaunt, its body bent in an unnatural way, almost as if it were folded in on itself. It had the same long, wild hair, the same ragged, old-fashioned dress. But this time, those eyes were different. They weren't hollow. They weren't black pits. They were her own. Clara staggered back, a scream caught in her throat. The figure was her. It was her, but different. The shadow of the woman from the previous building had morphed into something new, something more twisted, more personal. The figure stepped forward, its footsteps impossibly soft. Clara could hear her own voice, faintly, repeating the same words over and over again in the back of her mind. "Help me!" But as the figure drew closer, the words began to change. "You didn't help me." The voice, it was hers, but the tone was wrong. It was cold, accusatory, filled with a bitterness that wasn't hers to feel. Clara's chest tightened. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure reached up, its fingers long and cracked, and pointed directly at her chest. Clara's blood ran cold as the figure's mouth curled into a smile, though there was no warmth in it, only malice. "You are me," it said, "and you always were." Clara's mind spun. She stumbled backward, gripping the wall for support. "What are you talking about?" Her voice was barely a whisper now. I'm not you. I'm not." The figure didn't respond. It just tilted its head, and Clara's world tilted with it. The room around her began to spin, and suddenly everything clicked, like a puzzle piece falling into place. She remembered something from her childhood, something she had long forgotten. The house, the one she had grown up in, the place that had always felt wrong. The whispers she'd heard at night, the strange figure she'd seen in the corner of her bedroom when she was a little girl. She had pushed those memories so far back, convinced herself it was just the imagination of a scared child. But now, those memories came rushing back like a tidal wave, drowning her. The woman who had stood at the foot of her bed wasn't just some stranger. She wasn't a random ghost that had followed her from an old apartment. It was her. The woman who had died, who had been murdered, was Clara's own mother. The woman had died in the house Clara had grown up in, many years ago. She had never understood what happened to her mother, only that she had disappeared one night, leaving Clara to live with her distant, cold father. But Clara had never asked too many questions. She had buried the memory deep within her, unable to confront the terrifying truth. But now the truth had found her. "You didn't help me?" the figure repeated, taking a step closer. "You never helped me. You left me to die." Clara's knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed onto the floor, her hands clutching her head as the weight of the revelation crushed her. The tapping, the whispers, had all been her mother, reaching out from beyond the grave, trying to tell Clara something she had refused to face. "You're just like him," the figure whispered. "You're just like him." Clara didn't know whether she was crying from the sheer horror of the truth or the pain of the haunting revelation that she had been running from her own past. She had moved from place to place, trying to escape the guilt and the darkness that had followed her. But now she understood. It wasn't the building that was haunted. It was her. The tapping would never stop. The whispers would never cease. The figure that had appeared before her, it was her, and it would stay with her, haunting her because Clara had never helped. And now it was too late to make things right. This story is based on real-life experiences with paranormal events, but it's woven into a narrative for a more eerie story. I had always been skeptical about the paranormal. Ghost stories were things to be laughed at, fodder for campfire tales. I preferred to live in the realm of logic and reason. But that all changed when I moved into the old house on Hawthorn Hill. I was in my late 20s, fresh out of college and looking for a place of my own. The house was an affordable option for someone starting out, and the realtor assured me that it had plenty of charm. The listing mentioned the history of the house, built in the 1800s by a prominent local family, but the details were vague. I wasn't interested in the past. I just needed a home. So I signed the papers and moved in. The house had an eerie beauty to it. Creaky floors, high ceilings, and long, narrow hallways. The wallpaper was peeling in places, and the windows were covered with thick curtains that kept the house darker than I preferred. But I didn't mind. It was cozy enough, and the quietness of the neighborhood was a welcome change after the noise of the city. But from the moment I spent my first night there, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was a weight in the air, a presence that seemed to lurk just beyond my vision. At night, I would hear faint creaks and groans in the walls, sounds that I convinced myself were just the house settling. But the oddest thing was the cold spots. No matter how high I turned the thermostat, there would always be certain rooms, like the hallway near the staircase, that felt unbearably cold. It was a chill that seemed to seep into your bones. I thought it was just the age of the house. The heating was old-fashioned, inefficient. But then the strange occurrences began. Started small, a shadow passing by the window when I knew no one was outside. The occasional flickering of lights that I assumed was just an electrical issue. But one night, after coming home late from work, I entered my bedroom and found the bed completely messed up. Sheets and blankets thrown around, the pillow out of place. I was certain I had made the bed that morning, but there it was, as though someone had been lying there. I told myself I was overreacting. I'd been under a lot of stress with work, and maybe I was just imagining things. But then things escalated. It was a Sunday evening when I first heard the whispers. I had just sat down on the couch with a book when I heard it. A soft murmur, like voices in the next room. At first, I assumed it was the TV from the neighbors next door, but it was too faint, too muffled. I stood up and walked through the house, checking every room. Empty.
Dead silent.
No one was there, and yet the whispers continued, rising in volume as if urging me to listen. I went back to the living room and froze. From the corner of my eye, I saw something move in the hallway, the shadow of a figure standing at the far end, just outside the reach of the dim light. It was tall, thin, with a shape that reminded me of a person, but wrong. The figure seemed to float, and as my eyes locked onto it, it vanished. I spent the next few nights trying to make sense of it all. Could I have been sleep deprived? Had I imagined the shadow, the voices? I tried to brush it off, but deep down, I knew that something wasn't right. And then the worst thing happened. It was a Friday evening when the knocking started. I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner when I heard a series of soft raps on the wall near the stairs. Knock, knock, knock. I froze, knife in hand. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a neighbor. The sound was coming from inside the house, close, unmistakable. I went to the hallway, and again, the air was thick with that familiar chill. I checked the door. Nothing. I checked the windows. Closed. The knocking continued, now accompanied by faint scratching noises, like fingernails scraping against wood. My heart was in my throat. I thought of calling the landlord or the police, but the rational part of me told me it would only make me seem crazy. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I tried to ignore it. That didn't last long. The following week, I was at work when I received a strange message from the landlord. It was brief, almost casual. I forgot to mention something. There's a history with the house. Some people say it's haunted. Don't worry, though. It's probably nothing. I laughed it off. Probably nothing? He might as well have said, "This place is haunted," in bold letters. That night, I decided to do some research on the house's history. What I found was disturbing. The house had been built by a wealthy family in the late 1800s, the Hawthorn family. They had lived there for generations until, in the early 1900s, a tragic fire broke out in the house, killing the entire family. The fire was said to have started in the kitchen, but no one could ever figure out how. The house had been abandoned after that, sitting empty for decades. But that wasn't all. According to local rumors, a servant girl had been living in the house when the fire broke out. Her name was Clara, and she had been only 18 at the time. Some said she had died in the fire, while others claimed she had been seen wandering the house long after the flames had consumed everything. The whispers of her ghost lingered in the town, though no one could verify if the stories were true. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The air in the house felt thick and suffocating, and the whispers had returned, louder this time, though I couldn't make out the words. The next day, I spoke to an elderly neighbor who had lived in the area for decades. I didn't tell him everything, just that I'd heard strange noises in the house. He didn't say much at first, just nodded gravely. Then, after a long pause, he looked me in the eyes and said, "You're not the first to hear her, you know, Clara. She's been waiting a long time. Some people say she wants revenge, but others say she's just lonely. But no one who's lived in that house has ever stayed long. Not after she makes herself known." I tried to laugh it off, but I couldn't. That night, I decided I needed to confront whatever was haunting the house. I gathered my courage and walked through the darkened halls, each step echoing in the silence. I went to the kitchen where the fire had begun, now nothing more than a faded relic of its past. As I stood there, I felt the temperature drop drastically, the chill biting into my skin. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow. It was Clara. Her figure, pale and translucent, hovered in the doorway of the kitchen, her long, dark hair falling in front of her face. She didn't move. She didn't make a sound. For a long moment, we simply stood there, staring at one another. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she vanished, leaving behind only the overwhelming cold and the sound of my own racing heart. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I packed my things and left the house on Hawthorn Hill. I couldn't stay there anymore, not with Clara's presence lingering in the walls, the shadows, the silence. I never went back, and to this day I haven't. The house is still there, sitting on that lonely hill, waiting for its next tenant. And I have no doubt that Clara is still waiting too. The mirror on Maple Street. Sarah, Alexa, and Daphne had been friends since middle school. They were inseparable, even as they grew older, their bond only strengthening despite the challenges of high school. They had always been a curious trio, the kind of girls who didn't mind sneaking into the woods at night or exploring abandoned houses on weekends. But their latest adventure would lead them into something darker than they could have ever imagined. It all started with the discovery of an old mirror. It had been a Friday afternoon, and the girls were browsing through a local flea market when they stumbled upon it. The mirror was large, framed in dark mahogany with intricate carvings, the kind of frame you'd expect to find in a Victorian house. But there was something about it that stood out, something that made Sarah feel an odd sense of unease the moment she touched it. She couldn't explain it, just a fleeting, unsettling sensation as her fingers brushed against the glass. "Isn't it beautiful?" Alexa asked, running her fingers over the carvings. "It must be ancient." Daphne was already trying to negotiate with the vendor, an older man with a weathered face who seemed strangely eager to sell the mirror. "How much?" she asked. $50, he said without hesitation. "That's a steal," Sarah murmured. "It looks, well, I don't know, it has this strange vibe about it." "Oh, come on," Alexa said, giving her a playful nudge. "It's just a mirror. It's probably just old, that's all." The man smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's a special mirror," he added in a low voice. "You'll see. Everyone does, eventually." None of them paid much attention to the vendor's cryptic words. The mirror was too intriguing to pass up. With the deal done, they loaded it into the back of Sarah's car and drove back to their town, unaware that they had just brought something into their lives that they couldn't escape. That night, they decided to place the mirror in the attic of Sarah's house. Her family had recently moved into an old Victorian home on Maple Street, and the attic was large and empty, perfect for something as imposing as the mirror. "Let's test it out," Daphne said, grinning. "I dare you guys to stare into it for a minute straight." "Ugh, no way," Alexa replied, shivering. "You can't make me." Sarah, however, was drawn to it. She had always been the more curious one. "I'll do it," she said, stepping forward. The mirror's surface was smooth, almost impossibly so. As Sarah stood in front of it, she didn't know what she expected. Maybe some sort of reflection that would give her chills, or maybe the mirror would simply reflect her and her friends. But that's not what happened. At first, there was just her, Sarah's reflection, standing in the middle of the attic. The room behind her seemed dim, filled with shadows cast by the lone light bulb overhead. But then Sarah felt it. The air in the room seemed to grow colder, and the shadows in the reflection began to move. They twisted unnaturally, stretching and curling like smoke. Her reflection, though still hers, seemed different. Her heart began to race. She blinked hard, trying to clear her vision. But the Sarah in the mirror was still there, her eyes wide with a deep, almost unnatural fear, though Sarah herself felt fine. Almost too fine. It was like the reflection had a mind of its own. "Sarah?" Alexa's voice came from behind her, filled with concern. Sarah snapped out of her trance and quickly pulled away from the mirror. Her pulse thudded in her ears. What was that?" she asked, her voice shaking. Daphne stepped forward, peering into the mirror. "What's wrong?" "I don't see anything." The mirror reflected the three girls standing in the attic, just as it should. But when Sarah glanced back at her reflection, she saw her face twist into an expression she didn't recognize. Cold, angry. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the strange expression was gone. The girls exchanged uneasy glances. "I don't like this," Sarah said, backing away from the mirror. "There's something off about it." But Alexa and Daphne weren't convinced. They laughed it off, not understanding what Sarah had felt. "You're just freaked out because of the atmosphere. It's an old house," Alexa said, slapping Sarah on the back. "It's probably nothing." Despite their reassurance, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was watching them. That night, she lay awake in bed, hearing the faintest scratching noises from upstairs. She dismissed it as the house settling. The next morning, things got even stranger. The mirror was no longer in the attic. It had somehow moved itself down to the living room, leaning against the wall as though someone had placed it there deliberately. "What the hell?" Daphne said, her eyes wide with confusion. "How did it get down here?" Sarah's stomach twisted. She knew the mirror hadn't been moved by any of them, but the others were laughing it off, assuming one of them had carried it down while sleepwalking or something ridiculous like that. Sarah knew better. That night, things took a darker turn. Sarah woke up to the sound of whispers coming from the living room. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just the wind or the house making noises. But as she lay there, heart pounding, the whispers grew louder, clearer, until she could make out words. Sarah, Alexa, Daphne. Her name was first, and then it was followed by the other two. She tried to call out to her friends, but when she turned over to reach for her phone, she froze. There, standing in the corner of her bedroom, was a figure, a woman, dressed in a white, tattered dress, her face obscured by dark hair, her hands stretched out towards Sarah in an unnatural way. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. The figure took a step forward, and Sarah's heart nearly stopped. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from downstairs. It broke the spell. Sarah bolted upright and grabbed her phone. She sent a quick text to Alexa and Daphne. "Get up. Something's in the house." Minutes later, both girls arrived at her room, wide-eyed, their faces pale. "There's someone downstairs," Sarah whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. They cautiously crept down the stairs, and the living room was empty. The mirror was gone. Again. This time it was outside on the porch, leaning against the front door as if waiting for them. The three girls stood frozen, staring at the mirror as the door creaked open, revealing only blackness beyond. Then the whispers started again. Sarah, Alexa, Daphne. They were no longer coming from the mirror. They were coming from inside the house. The walls, the ceiling, the floor. "Get out!" A voice hissed from the shadows. It was neither male nor female, young nor old, just hollow, like a distant memory of something long dead. In a panic, the girls ran from the house, leaving it behind, but the whispers continued to follow them, fading into the night like a twisted echo. Sarah never went back to the house on Maple Street. No one ever did. The mirror was found months later, abandoned in the woods behind the house, its surface cracked and marred, reflecting only dark, endless woods. Some say that whoever stares into that mirror becomes a part of it, trapped forever in a world where the reflections have a life of their own. And that's how Sarah, Alexa, and Daphne learned that some mirrors shouldn't be touched. The Haunting of 421 Willow Lane. The following story is based on true events. When I first moved into 421 Willow Lane, I was excited. It was a fresh start. A new city, a new apartment, a new life. I was a graduate student, starting a new chapter away from home. The apartment was modest but cozy, and I quickly grew fond of the quiet neighborhood and the friendly neighbors who welcomed me with open arms. But from the beginning, something felt off. It wasn't the apartment itself, but the energy within it. The air was always a little too cold, even when the heater was on full blast. At night, the sound of footsteps would echo through the empty halls, and I'd tell myself it was just the building settling or the neighbors upstairs. But even then, the oddities didn't stop. I had been living in the apartment for about a month when the first strange incident occurred. I had been doing some late-night studying, the kind that left me exhausted and sleep-deprived. I was in the middle of writing a paper when I heard a faint tap on the window. I stood up, thinking it was just a branch brushing against the glass. But when I pulled back the curtain, there was nothing there. No tree, no wind. Just darkness. I laughed it off, told myself it was a figment of my tired mind, and returned to my work. But over the next few days, the tapping grew louder. And it wasn't just on the window. Sometimes it was the door. Sometimes it came from the hallway outside, even though I knew no one was there. Each time I would rush to check, but each time the hallway would be empty. It was easy to dismiss the noises at first. There were a lot of old buildings in the area, and the creaks and groans of aged wood were bound to cause some unease. But then the whispering started. I was sitting on the couch one evening, watching TV, when I heard it. Faint, but distinct. A soft murmur, almost like someone speaking just beyond the door. I turned down the volume, straining to listen. The voice wasn't clear, but it sounded like someone was repeating my name. Hey, Sarah, it whispered. I froze. My name was Sarah, but I knew I was the only one in the apartment. My heart started to race. I turned off the TV, listening in the silence. No one, but the voice didn't stop. It sounded distant, like it was coming from the other side of the door, down the hallway. At first, I thought I was imagining things. The sound of my name could have been carried from outside. But it happened again, multiple times. It wasn't always my name. Sometimes it was just a soft whispering sound, too soft to make out the words. I started to dread being home alone. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the neighbors, or perhaps the apartment just had thin walls. But something inside me was starting to panic. The whispers became more frequent, and the sensation that I was being watched started to overwhelm me. It wasn't just the feeling of being alone. It was something far worse. It was the feeling of being observed. One night, things escalated. I had just gotten back from class and was walking into my apartment when I noticed something unusual. The hallway light, which I always left off, was on. I was certain I had never turned it on, and yet, there it was, illuminating the hallway with an eerie glow. I thought maybe I had forgotten, but as I walked inside, I noticed something else. The door to the bedroom was slightly ajar. This too was strange. I had always closed it completely. My heart raced as I approached the door, a chill running down my spine. I didn't want to go in. Something about the room felt wrong, but I had to check. When I stepped inside, I was greeted by an overwhelming sense of dread. The room was colder than the rest of the apartment, the air thick with a presence I couldn't explain. And then I saw it. On the floor, in the center of the room, was a circle. A chalk circle. It was drawn in a pale, dusty residue, the lines uneven and faint, but unmistakable. I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't something I had done. I never used chalk, nor did I know where it could have come from. My first thought was that it was a prank, maybe a joke from a friend or a neighbor, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I immediately left the room and locked the door, my mind racing with possibilities. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept hearing those whispers again, faint but persistent, coming from all corners of the apartment. I tried calling friends, but none of them could come over. So, I did what anyone would do in that situation. I grabbed a bottle of wine and decided to confront it. I sat in the living room, staring at the door to my bedroom, hoping the presence wouldn't get closer. The whispers came and went, but I didn't leave. I felt like I couldn't, as if I was trapped in the apartment by something I couldn't see. Hours passed, and I finally managed to fall asleep on the couch, exhaustion taking over. The next morning, I awoke to a disturbing sight. The chalk circle was gone, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that it had been replaced with something else. Written on the floor, in the same chalky residue, were the words, "Get out." I couldn't explain it. I was alone in the apartment. No one had been in my room since I had locked the door, and yet there it was, a message. But this wasn't a simple prank. There was something deeply menacing about it. I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things in a panic, and I never looked back. I couldn't be sure what had happened in that apartment, but I knew I wasn't the only one who had experienced it. I later found out from a few other tenants that strange occurrences had happened in that building before. Some people claimed to hear footsteps in the halls. Others reported seeing shadows darting across their rooms in the middle of the night. No one could explain it, but the whispers and the writing had gotten to me. I moved out and never returned. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been in that apartment had been waiting for me. Maybe it had been there for years, watching each new tenant, waiting for someone to notice. I don't know what it wanted. All I know is that I'm glad I got out before it was too late. And to this day, I can't look at a hallway light the same way again. The mystery of the Ghostly Gale. On the edge of a misty lake, there lay an old boat, abandoned and forgotten. Locals called it the Ghostly Gale, for it was said to be haunted by the spirit of Captain Elias, a sailor who had mysteriously vanished on a stormy night decades ago. Whispers of his ghostly figure appearing on the deck sent shivers down the spines of anyone who dared to approach. One fateful evening, a curious girl named Lila, drawn by the tales of the haunted boat, decided to investigate. Armed with only a flashlight and her courage, she paddled her kayak towards the eerie vessel. As she drew closer, the air grew thick with an unsettling chill, and the water rippled as if something beneath the surface stirred. Lila climbed aboard the Ghostly Gale, her heart pounding with excitement and fear. The boat creaked under her weight, and she could feel an inexplicable presence surrounding her. Suddenly, a gust of wind swept through the air, and she heard a faint voice calling out, "Help me find my way home." Determined to uncover the truth, Lila began to search the boat, discovering old maps and a weathered journal belonging to Captain Elias. The entries spoke of a hidden treasure and a promise made to return to the lake, but the last pages were filled with despair, hinting at a betrayal that led to his demise. As night fell, Lila realized that the only way to help the captain's spirit find peace was to solve the mystery of his lost treasure. Little did she know, the lake held secrets that were waiting to be uncovered, and the ghostly presence would not rest until the truth was revealed. Lying awake in bed, Lila, her thoughts would go to the journal, only to feel a strong determination coming in her. The quiet specularity of the moon reflected some abstract light on the paper, so I read the final notes of the captain. They provided description of the nothing behind the rock that is reasonably impossible to be seen by any human being, as the treasure was believed to be buried there. But there were indications in the entries of a treachery that had been committed by an employee of the ship because of greed. As Lila pieced together the clues, she realized she needed to find this cove before dawn. With the journal as her guide, she scoured the boat for anything that could help her navigate the lake. She found an old compass, its needle spinning wildly, but she trusted her instincts and set her course based on the journal's descriptions. Paddling back to the shore, Lila felt the weight of the captain's spirit lingering beside her. The water shimmered, reflecting the stars above, and she could almost hear the whispers of the past urging her on. As she reached the shoreline, the fog thickened, wrapping around her like a shroud. Following the journal's directions, Lila trekked through the dense woods surrounding the lake. Each step felt heavier, as if the forest itself was watching her. Finally, she stumbled upon a clearing that opened up to the cove, a secluded spot with rocks jutting out like ancient sentinels. The air was thick with anticipation, and Lila could sense that she was close to uncovering the truth. With a sense of urgency, she began to search the area, digging through the soft earth and brushing aside leaves. Just as she was about to lose hope, her fingers hit something hard. Heart racing, she unearthed a small, ornate chest, its surface covered in intricate carvings. Lila knew she had found what Captain Elias had been searching for all along. As she opened the chest, a bright light emanated from within, and she felt the presence of the captain grow stronger, guiding her to the resolution that would finally bring him peace. As Lila opened the chest, she was greeted by a dazzling array of jewels and gold coins. But what caught her attention was a delicate locket nestled among the treasures. It was engraved with the initials E and M, and Lila instantly recognized it as the token of love that Captain Elias had lost when his beloved, Margot, was taken from him. With trembling hands, Lila held the locket close to her heart. In that moment, she could feel the weight of the captain's sorrow lifting. The air around her shimmered, and the ghostly figure of Captain Elias appeared, his expression one of gratitude and relief. "Thank you, brave girl," he whispered, his voice echoing like a gentle breeze. "You have brought me back to my love." As Lila watched, the spirit of Captain Elias began to glow brighter, the anguish in his eyes replaced by a serene joy. The locket floated from her hands, hovering in the air before him. With a final, grateful smile, he reached out, and the locket vanished into the light surrounding him. In that instant, Lila felt a rush of warmth and peace envelop her. The captain's spirit faded into the night, finally reunited with Margot. The heavy fog that had surrounded the cove began to lift, revealing the stars twinkling brightly above. Lila returned to the shore, her heart full of the stories she would tell. She had not only uncovered a hidden treasure, but had also helped a lost soul find closure. As she paddled back across the lake, she knew she would carry the memory of Captain Elias and Margot with her forever, a reminder of the power of love and the importance of letting go. The haunted whispers of the past had finally been silenced, and the lake was peaceful once more. The catacombs of Paris. Deep beneath the bustling streets of Paris lay a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers known as the catacombs. This eerie underground cemetery, lined with the bones of over 6 million souls, held secrets that had been buried for centuries. Few dared to wander into its depths, but for Clara, the thrill of the unknown was irresistible. Clara was a young girl with a passion for exploration and a fascination with the paranormal. She had heard whispers of the Lady in White, a vengeful spirit said to roam the catacombs, searching for her lost love. Intrigued by the legend, Clara decided that she would uncover the truth behind the spirit and the mysteries of the catacombs. One chilly evening, armed with only a flashlight and her courage, Clara entered the dark entrance of the catacombs. The air was damp and heavy, filled with the scent of earth and decay. As she ventured deeper, the light from her flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls adorned with skulls and bones. Clara felt a chill run down her spine but pressed on, determined to find the Lady in White. As she wandered through the narrow passages, Clara's heart raced at the thought of encountering the ghostly figure. She had read that the Lady in White was once a beautiful woman who had been betrayed by her lover. Heartbroken, she had wandered the catacombs for eternity, seeking vengeance on those who had wronged her. Clara felt a strange connection to the spirit, as if their fates were intertwined. Suddenly, Clara heard a soft whisper echoing through the darkness. "Help me find him." The voice sent shivers down her spine, but Clara's curiosity pushed her forward. She followed the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. The whisper led her to a vast chamber, its walls lined with bones, where the air felt charged with an otherworldly energy. In the center of the chamber stood the Lady in White, her ghostly figure shimmering in the dim light. Clara gasped, captivated by the beauty and sorrow of the spirit. The lady's eyes, filled with longing, met Clara's gaze. "You can help me?" she implored, her voice a haunting melody. "I seek my lost love, a man named Etienne. He was taken from me, and I cannot find peace without him." Clara felt a surge of empathy for the spirit. What happened to him? She asked, her voice trembling. The lady in white began to recount her tragic tale. Etienne had been a brave soldier, lost in the chaos of war. The lady had waited for him, but he never returned. Consumed by grief, she had wandered the catacombs, forever searching for her beloved. Moved by the lady's sorrow, Clara vowed to help her find Etienne. I will help you, she promised. Together, we will uncover the truth. The lady's expression softened, and a glimmer of hope shone in her eyes. Clara and the lady began their search through the catacombs, retracing Etienne's last steps. They encountered cryptic symbols etched into the walls and remnants of forgotten lives. Clara felt a strange energy guiding her, as if the spirits of the catacombs were watching over them. As they ventured deeper, they stumbled upon a hidden chamber, its entrance obscured by shadows. Inside, Clara discovered a weathered journal belonging to Etienne. The pages were filled with his thoughts and dreams, revealing his love for the lady and his longing to return to her. But as Clara read on, she discovered a dark secret. Etienne had been betrayed by those he trusted, leading to his untimely demise. Clara's heart ached for the couple, their love torn apart by fate. We must find his remains, she said, determination filling her voice. Only then can you be reunited. The lady nodded, her ethereal form flickering with hope. Guided by the journal, they navigated the twisting tunnels, following clues that led them closer to Etienne's resting place. Along the way, Clara felt the presence of other spirits, their whispers echoing in her mind. They urged her to continue to seek justice for the wrongs of the past. Finally, after what felt like hours, they arrived at a secluded alcove. Clara's heart raced as she spotted a small, crumbling tombstone, half buried in the earth. The name etched into the stone read Etienne. Clara knelt down, her hands trembling as she brushed away the dirt, revealing the remains of the lost soldier. The lady in white gasped, her sorrow palpable. At last, I have found him, she whispered, tears streaming down her ghostly face. Clara could feel the weight of the moment, the culmination of their journey. Finally, after all those years, the lady in white, been able to reunite with her beloved Etienne. Clara left the catacombs with pride that she had at least been able to bring salvation to one tormented spirit. She knew then that she would definitely return another time. The mystery of the lady in white. In the heart of a forgotten town lay an old cemetery, shrouded in mist and mystery. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones about the place, warning others to stay away after dark. They claimed it was haunted by the spirits of those who had never found peace, their restless souls wandering among the crumbling tombstones. One chilly autumn evening, a curious girl named Clara decided to explore the cemetery. Armed with only a flickering flashlight, she stepped through the wrought iron gate, the creaking sound echoing in the stillness. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and Clara felt a shiver run down her spine. As she wandered deeper into the graveyard, she noticed a figure standing near an ancient oak tree. It was a woman dressed in a flowing white gown, her long hair cascading around her shoulders. Clara's heart raced as she approached, recognizing the legend of the lady in white, a spirit said to mourn the loss of her beloved, who had been buried long ago. Why do you weep? Clara asked softly, her voice trembling. The lady in white turned, her eyes filled with sorrow. I search for my love, lost to me in this life, she replied, her voice echoing like a distant whisper. He was taken too soon, and I cannot rest until I find him. Determined to help, Clara asked, what is his name? The spirit's gaze pierced through the darkness as she replied, Elias. He was a brave sailor, lost at sea on a stormy night. Clara felt a surge of compassion for the grieving spirit and promised to help her find closure. Clara spent the following days researching the town's history, uncovering tales of shipwrecks and lost souls. With each discovery, she felt closer to the lady in white and her tragic love story. Finally, she learned of a hidden treasure that Elias had left behind, a locket containing their photographs, believed to be buried near the shore. That night, Clara returned to the cemetery, the moonlight illuminating her path. She called out to the lady in white, who appeared before her, hope flickering in her ethereal eyes. Together, they made their way to the shore, where Clara dug into the sand, her heart racing with anticipation. After what felt like an eternity, her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. She unearthed the locket, its surface glinting in the moonlight. As she opened it, the faces of Elias and the lady in white smiled back at her, their love immortalized in time. With tears in her eyes, Clara handed the locket to the spirit. "You can finally be together again," she whispered. The lady in white took the locket, her expression transforming from sorrow to pure joy. "Thank you, dear child," she said, her voice now filled with warmth. As the locket vanished in a swirl of light, the lady in white began to fade, her spirit finally at peace. Clara felt a wave of calm wash over her, knowing she had helped a lost soul find closure. The cemetery, once filled with whispers of sorrow, now stood silent, bathed in the soft glow of the moon, a testament to the power of love and the importance of letting go. This concludes today's stories. I hope you enjoyed this compilation. Let me know in the comments what kind of stories you would like to hear more from. Please like and subscribe if you're into scary stories like. And after that, all I've left to say is, stay safe and I'll see you in a few days.